The grievance culture is out of control, and the victim cult has grown increasingly toxic. So argues our next guest, prolific writer, columnist, publisher of multiple studies, and author of the new book, The Victim Cult: How the Grievance Culture Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. Professor Mark Milke, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.
So tell me, when you say victim cult, are you talking about individuals who adhere to the idea of systematic victimhood that keeps them down? Or is it more social groups or racial groups, or sort of a political wing that seeks power and recognition?
Well, all of the above, right? Everyone knows someone who thinks like a victim. Now, they may have been, and we shouldn't downgrade that, or we shouldn't, we should have compassion for those who are actual victims. But everyone knows someone who thinks like an actual victim, whether they have been or not, and wallows in that. And that's a mistake for their own future, as well as all of us. But the victim cult actually looks at what happens when entire groups or even nations latch onto this notion that we're all victims and almost become touchy and paranoid about that. And where does that lead? So in the victim cult, I give various examples from Germans starting in the early 1800s who were victims of the French who had invaded them and yet became really touchy. And as a result, basically went into this isolationist shell for a century and a half and said, look, we don't like Jews, we don't like the English, we don't like liberalism, we don't like the Enlightenment. And this became a real problem. And to put it mildly, and they became fans of cultural purity, and you hear these arguments again today. Don't infect our culture. And of course, later on, the Germans became enamored with race purity, another disastrous, murderous, mistaken road that they trod. So the victim cult is really about groups and societies and entire nations that wallow in victimhood, real or fake, but to their own detriment and to those of others, and almost destroy and sometimes do destroy entire civilizations. But it applies to the person. It can apply to an entire country.
Yeah, I think it's clear to almost everyone that there is a type of also victimhood hierarchy that stems from individuals to groups to societies and things like this. And to some degree, rightly or wrongly, these groups and the hierarchy of the victimhood, it's recognized in law and custom to some degree. And your book here, I think it makes the case that this particular culture is terminally destructive to the society it inhabits. So what's your main case for this?
Well, a number of things. I mean, look, this seems to be part of human nature. I mean, the Genesis narrative, the story of Adam and Eve, and picking from the fruit from the tree of good and evil and the fruit. God says, "Don't pick the fruit." What do Adam and Eve do? Well, they pick the fruit of the tree of good and evil. Adam blames Eve. Eve blames the snake. Adam even blames God and says, "Why did you give me this person? Why did you give me this wife?" Everybody's blaming somebody else as opposed to taking responsibility. So it doesn't help when people don't take responsibility for their own actions. And in fact, by blaming others, it allows you to escape perhaps your own blame, your own responsibility in some event that's taken place. I also think it's very un-American. So for example, the traditional American ethos has been, look, we're going to succeed. We're going to be entrepreneurial. We're going to make the best of it. We've left those Europeans and English behind back in the 1700s and 1800s, and we're going to build a country that's founded on this notion of the individual. Well, what victimhood sort of thinking does is it says, look, I'm not responsible for my current state. And some groups, I mean, you see some, only some, I would argue, Black leaders in the United States who blame current differences, say in outcomes and averages between Black Americans and other Americans on slavery that has been gone for over 170 years, 180 years, almost 2 centuries, well, a century and a half. So this becomes a real problem because then you look back and you blame things on 20 years ago or 150 years ago, or Bill Clinton blaming part of 9/11 on the Crusades 1,000 years ago. I mean, that was ridiculous. I mean, the Crusades had disappeared from the Arab memory and was reintroduced into the Arab memory by Europeans in the 1800s, in part in a debate over colonialism. And some wanted to blame and said, you as Arabs should blame the Crusades and colonialism for your plight. This is a real problem. Now, look, there are instances where there's a cause and effect link. So in the late 1700s, Quakers released their slaves and compensate them because they recognized we have obviously hampered you as a human being and hampered your group, Black Americans. And the Quakers did the right thing. But 2 centuries later, to talk about compensation or restitution for slavery, well, that ignores all sorts of other factors that go into incomes and education today, parental influence, family breakup, again, whether you choose to go to college or not. So the danger in becoming a permanent victim and saying I or my group are the result of what happened yesterday, or especially 50 years ago or 100 years ago, is that you're going to have mistaken cause and effect links, as opposed to the traditional American ethos of, listen, it's not a perfect world. People are jerks sometimes. Sometimes my tribe beat up your tribe 100 years ago or 1,000 years ago or vice versa. But we're going to have to get along, and we need to treat each other as individuals. Now, again, that I wouldn't dismiss actual cases of victimization or tragedies and compensation. Japanese Americans should have been compensated and were to some degree in the 1950s for their land that was stolen by the government in the 1940s. But that's a clear cause and effect link. The further you go back, the weaker that link becomes. So that's the danger with becoming a permanent victim. You start to think you have no agency, no control over your future, and that's a mistake.
I think that there's a couple of very interesting points you raised there. One about the present disparities in outcome, I guess, is what we're looking at, rather than what goes into it, is they've actually improved. And then from a more recent period in history, they've then gotten worse, literally within living memory, that they've gotten worse. So that really puts to test the idea that these are outcomes from slavery that happened before. And the other part that really struck out at me there is you mentioned this going back to Genesis. It's very interesting that now I'm not a Bible scholar by any means, but Cain was said to say, I've made sacrifices. I've done this. Why am I still persecuted by you, God? Mm-hmm. And God says, well, you let the sin in. You let that come into your life. And I think that's a very, not that people who see themselves as victims or in a victim cult per se, that they've let sin into their lives, but that they've accepted the idea that there is a sin and that is responsible for their issues. Now, is it fair to equate the idea that there are cultural victims and cultural oppressors, which is what seems to be that you're explaining the mindset behind the victim cult? Is it fair to equate that with Marxism? Because to me, that seems like a fairly obvious parallel, but maybe I'm not catching it right. What are your thoughts?
Well, I delve into Marxism a little bit in the victim cult, and I think you're onto something. Marxism taught people that they were victims of capitalists, right? Victims of free enterprise, really. Victims of trade flows, which had gone on ever since, the first person in Samaria traded a fish for grain on shore. So Marxism traditionally was into the blame game as well. I mean, if you look back at the writings of Chairman Mao or, Joseph Stalin or any of the, Lenin, they took on landlords, for example. I mean, they blamed anybody with any money for the conditions of the poor. And it was a misunderstanding of the economy, right? The economy has grown over time and we all contribute to it. And so the blame game was certainly there in Marxism. It still is, insofar as Marxism has an effect today, and it does in some places. Campuses, probably among other places where, it still lingers on. But yeah, this notion of, abdicating responsibility for your own choices. I mean, the Cain and Abel story that you mentioned, which is in the introduction to the victim cult, is a really good example of not taking responsibility. I mean, let's go through it. I have a bit of a sort of an alternate theory on the Cain and Abel story. Traditionally, the Cain and Abel story is taught to people in Sunday school who went to Sunday school that, be careful not to become bitter like Cain did. Well, there's another possible lesson you can take from the Cain and Abel story. Maybe Cain was treated unfairly by God. I mean, you have other Old Testament figures, Lot and Moses and others, and who will argue with God and kind of dicker with him and go back and forth with God in the Old Testament. And it's quite intriguing to read. But Cain and Abel, this story, what happens is, Abel brings his sacrifice, which is meat. Cain brings vegetables. God rejects Cain's, and Cain gets his nose out of joint. But rather than actually argue with God or, the source of his problem, if you want to look at it that way, He blames Abel, who's got nothing to do with what just happened. I mean, Abel did the right thing, Cain did the wrong thing, at least according to the traditional interpretation. Now, again, unlike other Old Testament figures who once in a while will, dicker back and forth with the deity, Cain doesn't do this. He blames his brother, becomes bitter, and murders his own brother, at which point God says, "What have you done?" And Cain still won't accept responsibility. He says, "Am I my brother's keeper?" after he's just murdered him. I mean, this is a pretty serious story at this point. But what it shows is this is endemic to human nature. And there is this notion that I'm a victim, but rather than take responsibility in the cases where, again, or face up to maybe your oppressor. I mean, people don't think of God as an oppressor, but, that's an alternate reading of this particular scripture. Maybe he should have argued with God and, as other Old Testament figures do. He doesn't. So that's a problem when you don't face up to the source of either what is your problem or what you think is your problem. And that shows a certain bravery if you do, and a certain cowardice if you don't. So I actually start out with the victim cult with that very story of Cain and Abel, saying, be very careful to examine your own heart and your own actions first. You may be a victim, you may not be. Your society may be a victim, you may not be. I mean, there have been over 110 billion human beings alive in the history of the planet. There's 7, 8 billion of us now. We're going to bump into each other. Sometimes victims are created intentionally by others, right? By tyrants and the rest of it, or just mean people next door to you. So I'm not downplaying the notion of tragedies and victimhood, but what I am saying is be very careful not to allow you or your tribe, so to speak, to glom onto that notion and run with it, because that can become very destructive. It was in Germany. I've got a chapter on Rwanda. And I'll give an example in a moment of a very different approach by Asian Americans to victimization, which I think is very positive, actually, in the victim cult.
I mean, I seem to have these conversations about how victim groups, I guess they call the people, self-professed victim groups. And as you rightly point out, they don't ever tend to internalize or speak directly to their oppressor. That it's more a question of destroying the outward signs of the historical oppression. And we've seen this a lot in both your country, my country, in the United States, with statues being torn down, things like this. And it's one thing that always pops into my head is George Orwell's 1984 and how the past has become mutable under the powers to fit the present narrative, whether that's statues, books, and even more so narrative, I guess. And I think it's the changeability of narrative that creates such discord between those who see themselves as victims, as a group or as individuals, and those that are being held responsible. Now, in your estimation, is the ability to change the past to impact the present and future inherent in keeping the victim cult alive and strong? Does that make sense?
Well, let me answer that slightly different way. Let's go back to your point about people who, in essence, are attacking the past, right, by attacking statues. I mean, it's a really weird modern ideology to try and cleanse the past. I mean, we talked about Marxists a moment ago. In the 20th century, at least, in the 19th century, Marxists look forward to a perfect utopia, trying to create heaven on earth. I mean, what do modern sort of victim cultists do? Those who attack statues or blame the past for all present outcomes. In essence, what they're trying to do is create a perfect past. I mean, at least Marxists look forward and in the future thought they could change the future. You've got people who actually think by attacking statues or rewriting entire historical accounts, that they can sort of cleanse the past of evil or cleanse the past of these clashes between various groups, ours, yours, mine, whatever. It's a really weird utopian ideology as applied to the past. It makes even less sense than Marxism, which at least was utopian about the future. So that's one part of the victim cult where, well, who would expect the past to be perfect? I mean, my grandmother left Ukraine as a 3-year-old in 1914, tried to get to Canada with her family, obviously, was prevented by doing so by the outbreak of war at the port of, at a port in Latvia. Her and her family ended up traveling around Central Europe and then Siberia for literally about 13, 14 years before coming to Canada. She was a victim, for sure. But she didn't get stuck there. She never even learned how to read or write. I mean, for years, she would mark documents with an X. And I first noticed this as a kid and asked my parents about it. And they said, well, grandma never got to go to school. So there are real victims in history. But somehow her and my grandfather, who was a German that came from Poland in the 1920s, managed to carve out a life in Canada. Now, this is the typical American, Canadian and American, and there's immigrant success stories in the UK as well. These are typical immigrant success stories. But what they point to is the possibility to say, we're not going to deny that bad things have happened in the past, tragedies, but we better figure out how to not get stuck there, to acknowledge it, to make up for it where you can. If you stepped on my foot yesterday and break my toe, you might want to pay for my surgery today. But beyond that, we don't want to hang on to the past too tightly. And a great counterexample of this, which I can give, and I give in the last part of the victim cult, is the example of Asian Americans. I was digging through data for the victim cult. And what I found was, if you look, I found this really fascinating data about high school students and college students in the United States and in California in particular, but both nationwide and in that state from 1910, 1920, and 1930. And what I found was that in 1910, children of Japanese and Chinese Americans were attending and graduating from high school and college at rates slightly lower than white Americans. But by the 1920s and the 1930s, the children of Japanese and Chinese ethnicity, American, they might have been immigrants, they might have been Americans already, second generation. Those kids were graduating at rates higher than white Americans from high school and college. Now, this is the most discriminatory period in American history against Asian Americans. Right? There's an Immigration Act in the early 1920s that bans new immigration by Asians and others from around the world. And there's tremendous at-home discrimination, even against those who have citizenship and happen to be Asian ancestry. But nonetheless, they have concentrated on giving their kids an education, and it shows up in the data. And this actually sets the groundwork for the future success of what is now a cliche, what I call the Pacific class, the rise of the Pacific class, the rise of Asian Americans and their contribution to American society. But it starts with an emphasis on education during the most discriminatory period in American history. Nonetheless, it's a positive story in the victim cult of how you don't have to get stuck by the choices of others, by racists at the time, the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s.
So would you say that the book, The Victim Cult, is it more a warning about what could happen if the dark path is followed, or is it a roadmap for people to break out of this particular mindset? Or
well, I would say the former. Okay. I would say the former. I don't really do a Tony Robbins, with due respect, 1, 2, 3, here's how you get out of your situation. It really is kind of an historical and cultural account saying, look, this is a phenomenon in history. In Rwanda, you had people of the same color, but who consider themselves different ethnicities, Hutu and Tutsis. Pick on each other. First, the Tutsis on the Hutus pre-1960, pre-independence, and then the Hutus, who blamed everything, their outcomes, any negative outcomes, on Tutsi rule before 1960. And they did this for 30, 35 years through the state, through propaganda, through the media. And we know where that ended in 1993 with genocide in Rwanda. And so this notion that I'm a victim or that my tribe is a victim, again, even if true, and there's usually some truth to this notion, that one has been a victim, or one's tribe, one's whatever you want to call it, has been victimized at some point in history, again, given the history of the world. But the danger of getting stuck there, and the victim cult is about warning against letting people and politicians and those in the media carry that narrative along, because that can be very destructive. And it makes the same mistake. Let's suppose your tribe has been oppressed, whether your tribe is ethnic, racial, whatever it is, or gender. Let's suppose that's true. Well, what happened was you were not treated as an individual, or your ancestors were not treated as individuals. They were not looked at as individuals. And for us today, for someone to glom onto that, though, and say, because my tribe was not treated properly, those who came before me were not treated as individuals in this society, and Black Americans are an obvious example. Well, but to turn that around and to not treat others as individuals today is to make the same mistake that racists in the past made. So it's a very dangerous road to trod, and it leads to bad outcomes, to say the least.
Well, what are some of the other themes that you explore in the victim cult?
Well, one of the ironies is that you have even an entire class, a chattering class today, that blames any outcomes between groups when you measure, white Americans versus Asian Americans versus Black Americans versus Mexican Americans, any differences in outcomes. They blame it on, again, racism. It's monocausal. You'll see, various, prominent Black authors do this. Not all of them. There are plenty of exceptions. Thomas Sowell, Walter Williams, and others. Glenn Laurie, John McWhorter just wrote a book on this. But you do have, some authors that blame everything on racism. Well, that's a mistake. But there's also, and so I go into that in the book as well. And you'll see actually that, look, if everything's due to racism, how do you explain again the prominence of, say, East Indian Americans in the census data that have the highest incomes of anyone, and then those from Taiwan ancestry, those of Chinese ancestry more generally, or Japanese ancestry, or Korean. Those are at the top of the income heap, and there's a reason for that. It's because generally they have the highest education levels in American society, and that leads to higher incomes. So I try and dispel this notion that everything that is different between outcomes between groups and data is due to racism. It's not. I also go into this notion, again, from the chattering classes, that Western civilization is to blame somehow for an imperfect society. I mean, whether you live in the United Kingdom as you do, or in Canada as I do, or in the United States, we live in one of the most prosperous, flourishing times compared to any year in history, compared to any century in history. It's not perfect. We live in an imperfect world. We are imperfect human beings. But we should be grateful for the age we live in, despite a pandemic, despite what governments do, despite mistakes, despite wars and tragedy. We've had it pretty good compared to most people in human history. And so, but we've got an entire chattering class that thinks we live in this dystopian, racist society that somehow is oppressive. That's simply not true by any historical account. So I go into that. But the irony of that is these chattering classes, who also blame everything on people with, how can I put this, pale palettes, like mine and yours. The same thinkers that do this and blame Europeans or the Brits, colonialists, for any bad outcomes, take their ideas from Europeans, except they take it from Frantz Fanon, or they take it from, other European thinkers of, 50 and 60 years ago that just thought the West was, irredeemably evil. And so the irony is, if you want to blame sort of some bad outcomes today on Europeans, go ahead, but you should be blaming them on, French postmodernists and not early American thinkers, or, Adam Smith, or Abraham Lincoln, just because Abraham Lincoln lived in an imperfect age where there was still plenty of racism, post-Civil War, and plenty of oppression against Black Americans. So we live in this weird age where people again want to blame people based on skin color, instead of drawing the correct lesson that in past ages, people as individuals were not treated correctly because they had the wrong skin color. They were Black in 1865. But people don't draw the right lessons from that, or 1965 and Martin Luther King, in 1963, before that came to prominence. People don't draw the right lessons from history, which is don't make the same mistake and treat people as anything other than individuals in law and policy. But you've got plenty of voices today that somehow want to make up for past wrongs by really awarding jobs and incomes and college spots at Harvard based on race. That's utterly destructive. The Rwandans went down this road for 35 years. The Hutus did, literally discriminated against the Tutsis, mainly the former rulers of that country. And it came to a bad end because the Hutus propagandized their entire society, every Hutu, into believing that they were victims of the Tutsis. And that led to genocide. I mean, I don't think we're headed down that road in English-speaking countries. We have pretty strong institutions. But you do damage people and damage people's chances and opportunities when you don't treat them as individuals. Instead, you see them as somehow responsible for what? The fact that, again, their tribe beat up, another tribe, 2 centuries ago or 1,000 years ago in the Crusades. So I think people need to learn the right lessons from history and not make the mistake that has been made time and again vis-a-vis the individual.
Professor Mark Milke, author of the new book, The Victim Cult, How the Grievance Culture Hurts Everyone and Wrecks Civilizations. So Mark, please note, where can people get a copy of your book or follow you for your writings?
victimcult.com. They can also find me on LinkedIn, Twitter, the usual social media channels. But victimcult.com is probably the best place to find out where you can find the book. It's all over America and bookstores and Amazon. But victimcult.com is where you can find the Victim Cult.
Thanks ever so much. Very fascinating.
Thank you, Mark.
We're doing it for real, really real. Liberty Nation.
And Jeff Charles, contributor for LibertyNation.com.
I think we're starting to make an impact. Liberty style, fight for freedom.
Daily tracking poll sponsored by Liberty Nation for Thursday.
Mentioned by Dan Bongino, Rasmussen, Jordan Peterson, and
I
others.
can do it again if you want me to.
Cited in Mark Levin's American Marxism.
I think we're starting to make a really big impact. Get noticed. We're doing it. Rock on. I'm gone.